I want to get into a couple of those issues, in particular, this idea of shifting from chemical engineering. But before we get to that point, help us understand why there is an inflection point today. I mean, what has changed now in 2020 versus 1990?
That's a great point. And we're on a multi-decade arc, but I think to your point about especially the funds that we've raised, I think some of the earliest applications of this trend in engineering biology are in biopharma and healthcare delivery. And clearly, healthcare alone is a great challenge for our country. It was a challenge before COVID. It's going to be a challenge after COVID. And I think the big shift is if you think about how drugs are found, it's often called drug design, but it's really much more discovery. And that spontaneous act of discovery may or may not happen. A drug may or may not get through clinical trials. And that's partially why drugs are so expensive.
Mm-hmm.
The ability to engineer things is the shift from like discovering a bridge versus designing a bridge.
Right.
It's the ability to actually make something the way we want it to be.
What are the underlying technologies that have enabled this? We're mostly familiar with that wonderful curve that the National Institutes of Health produces on the declining cost of genome sequencing, and it's compared to Moore's law, and it's 100,000 times faster in terms of price declines at Moore's law.
Yeah, it's interesting to mention Moore's law because while Moore's law actually can play a role even in the healthcare side, because compute and machine learning and data science and all those things will be interesting. I don't know if you've heard this term, Eroom's law.
Eroom's law was coined by Jack Scannell, who's one of the readers of our newsletter. So we know Jack well.
For the people in the audience who may not be familiar with it, Eroom is actually Gordon Moore's last name spelled backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the idea that while the cost of compute is decreasing exponentially, the cost of drugs are increasing exponentially. And it's interesting to ask why. How could those things be decreasing exponentially and something else be increasing exponentially?
Right.
For computers, what it really is, it sounds magical that like in 10 years, a computer could be 1,000 times faster. In like 20 years, a computer could be 1,000,000 times faster. I was actually literally talking to my older daughter about this, that the computer I had at her age was probably 1,000,000 times slower than what she has now. And it's just hard to even like imagine that could actually, for her, that could even do anything. And so the magic, though, happens because Moore's law is really just let's make things 20% better year over year.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a funny thing. It's basically compounding interest.
Never bet against compound interest.
Yes. And so it takes a lot of work, a lot of genius, a lot of effort, and frankly, just a lot of knobs to turn to be able to say, well, 20% is like 3% of this and 7% of this and so on, and it all adds up. And due to human will in genomics and in storage and in compute and in other areas, they've been able to do this. It isn't discovery. You're not discovering a new computer. You're just grinding out engineering. What we need to do, and what we have been doing, is making this shift from discovery to engineering. And that is the thing that actually will fundamentally change all the non-Moore's law-like curves like Eroom's law.
And so that's taking us to a world of some new applications in this new world of biology, sometimes called synthetic biology or systems biology. I'm not sure which of those terms you prefer, or if you use a different term.
And I think they in my mind, they are slightly different. That systems is thinking about like just the whole cellular circuits, and synthetic biology might be manipulating individual genes or parts of it. And you can certainly do system synthetic biology too. If you
right. So there's some terminology in there, but I think from our conversation, the earlier part of your conversation, I picked up different applications. I picked up novel drugs and other healthcare applications, so genomic technologies and editing. I picked up new materials, so what do we do in order to build the materials that we currently use, and then also modifying food systems and the elements within food systems. Is that a fair taxonomy? Is there anything else we should include or anything we should exclude?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Today, I think where the big wins are is that you have to work within the system. And so we're seeing diagnostics that can have such high accuracy that you could find out that you have cancer at very early stages, such you could be cured. We're finding therapeutics in a ways that can be ground out and be done at very low cost, which is such a huge problem for therapeutics. So high efficacy with a low cost. Or even just, imagine if the healthcare system worked like Amazon, where right now the healthcare system is a huge logistical nightmare. And computers and tech are great at logistics. That's what Amazon basically is. So imagine that type of know-how applied to helping your grandmother in Medicare,
right?
And to rethink Medicare. But then finally, you talked about food. I mean, I think food is such a huge issue, and we have companies that are even thinking about just food waste, which is $1 trillion a year issue worldwide. And to feed the world, being able to attack food waste and have food last longer would be a first immediate material science breakthrough.
What's the thing that's genuinely in common between these 4 subsectors or sub-applications? Because what you've described to me, it seems like we're talking sometimes about very different types of scientific process, different value chains, different industry structures.
Yep.
Does it really hold together as a sector?
Yeah, I think these are very different go-to-markets. And so the engineering part will be comparable. The go-to-market will be very different, much like the go-to-market for bridges and cars and rockets are all very different. But that this engineering mindset applies throughout. We're going to find people coming from all these different disciplines and embracing this approach and just looking at the world and looking at the world's problems and thinking how to change it. But how you get that into consumers' hands, that's probably going to vary.
When we look at the IT sector, over the course of 50 years or slightly more than 50 years, there has been an ecology that has emerged of the types of capabilities that you need when you're building your team at a different stage, right? When do you need a VP of product? When do you need a VP of sales? What kind of engineer do you hire when you're at 2,000 people versus being at 20 people? And within that, Silicon Valley has become a self-sustaining, pretty mature ecosystem that has now spread elsewhere. Where is that talent dimension right now?
I think what we're talking about, it doesn't really have a good name yet, and it's very frustrating. And I think it hasn't, and because what we're talking about is combining the way you build a tech company at the efficiency and the scale and the engineering of that, an Intel or an Apple or a Google, with this bio and healthcare space. And so the words tech and bio are there, but it doesn't add up to biotech, which is actually a sort of a very different thing, is sort of more the old school approach. It regrettably doesn't have a good name, but I think you could just think of it as tech and tech in this space. If you brought a tech mindset to healthcare, what would that be? And I think people often also don't understand what a tech mindset is. I think, part of a tech mindset is understanding the domain that you're in. It doesn't mean that we have naive computer scientists who know nothing about healthcare jump in and say they can cure the world. It's about taking technologists that themselves have a deep experience on the engineering side as well as the domain. So when we look for founders, they understand the machine learning, but also understand the biology or the healthcare system. And that's actually really going to be critical. A lot of these founders now, they are trained as PhD biologists, but they've been using computers their whole lives.
Right.
And this is different than it was 20 years ago. It's fundamentally different. And I think their approach to tech is fundamentally different. They've grown up with tech around them.